March 28, 1945, 10:45 a.m. A reinforced concrete bunker deep within the Cabinet War Rooms, London. The air is thick, a cloying mixture of stale cigar smoke, damp wool, and the electric hum of a world at war. You can almost feel the vibration of the Thames overhead, but the real tremor is felt in the hands of Winston Churchill. He stares at a teleprint message, his jaw set in a grim line that even his finest brandy couldn't soften. The message isn't from the enemy. It's from SHAEF Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Specifically, it's from General Dwight D. Eisenhower. For months, the Allied machine had moved with the synchronized lethality of a Swiss watch. But as the Rhine was breached and the heart of the Reich lay exposed, the gears began to grind. Eisenhower had just made a decision that would bypass Berlin, shifting the weight of the American juggernaut toward the national redoubt in the south. To the Americans, it was sound logistics. To Churchill, it was a geopolitical earthquake. "He has changed the axis," Churchill mutters, the words catching in the back of his throat. Across the Atlantic and deep into the front lines, the special relationship was fraying at the edges. Churchill looks at the map of Europe, a sprawling mess of pins and string, and sees something Eisenhower refuses to look at: the encroaching red tide of the Soviet Union. While Ike looked at maps to win a war, Winston was looking at maps to save a civilization. The tension in the room is suffocating. Churchill knows that if he doesn't sway the Supreme Commander, now the Iron Curtain he so fears won't just be a metaphor. It will be a permanent border drawn in the blood of the men currently marching toward the Elbe. He picks up his pen, the nib hovering over the paper like a bayonet. He isn't just writing to a general. He is fighting for the future of the West. But Eisenhower, bolstered by the sheer industrial might of the United States and the unwavering support of Marshall in Washington, is no longer the junior partner who needs London's permission. He has the boots, he has the tanks, and increasingly, he has the final say. Churchill leans back, the smoke from his Romeo y Julieta swirling toward the ceiling. He needs to craft a response that is part plea, part command, and entirely desperate. Because if Eisenhower ignores the Allies today, the victory of tomorrow might feel a lot like a defeat. March 31, 1945, midnight. The Prime Minister's bedroom at 10 Downing Street. The only sound is the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen against thick parchment. Churchill is propped up in bed, his writing desk balanced on his knees, a posture of war he has maintained for 5 long years. But tonight, the ink feels heavier. He has just received Eisenhower's justification. Ike's logic is cold, clinical, and devastatingly American. Berlin is nothing but a prestigious objective. To the general, the city is a mop-up operation. He wants to pivot his army south toward Leipzig and the Bavarian Alps, fearing a phantom Nazi werewolf resistance that Churchill knows is a distraction. To lose Berlin, Churchill whispers to the empty room, is to lose the prize for which we have bled. He begins to dictate a cable to Eisenhower, his voice low and gravelly. He doesn't lead with military jargon, he leads with the soul of Europe. He writes of the moral effect of the Soviet arrival in the German capital. He points out that if the Red Army captures Berlin, the world will see them as the sole liberators of the continent. Visual. A flickering candle casting long shadows over a map where a giant red arrow points directly at the heart of Berlin. But there is a deeper sting. Eisenhower hadn't just changed the plan. He had communicated it directly to Joseph Stalin before consulting the British chiefs of staff. It was a breach of protocol that felt like a slap across the face of the British Empire. Churchill's jaw tightens. He realizes that the Big Three has become a Big Two, and he is being relegated to the role of an observer. In his message, Churchill's tone shifts from diplomatic to prophetic. He warns Eisenhower that if the Western Allies do not push as far east as possible, the Russian occupation will become a permanent fixture of European life. He is pleading for a dash to the capital. "I deem it highly important," he writes, his hand trembling slightly with a mix of fury and exhaustion, "that we should shake hands with the Russians as far to the east as possible." The cable is dispatched. It travels through the secure lines under the Atlantic and into the hands of a general who is currently looking at a different set of numbers, casualty projections. Eisenhower sees the cost of Berlin in American lives, perhaps 100,000 men. He doesn't care about the moral effect of a flag over the Reichstag. He cares about bringing his boys home. As the message arrives at Eisenhower's forward headquarters in Reims, the stage is set for a confrontation that will define the borders of the Cold War. Churchill waits by the secure phone, the silence of London feeling more ominous than the Blitz ever did. He is waiting to see if the man he helped elevate to Supreme Commander will finally turn his back on the British Lion. The reply from Reims is about to arrive, and it will contain a phrase that will haunt Churchill for the rest of his life. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sits in his office, the walls covered in topographical maps that track the death throes of the Third Reich. He holds Churchill's cable in his hand, the paper crinkling under his grip. To Ike, the Prime Minister's prose is poetic, but to a man responsible for 5 million soldiers, poetry is a luxury he can no longer afford. Eisenhower's response is not a debate. It is a declaration of independence. He informs Churchill that his primary goal is the destruction of the enemy's forces, not the occupation of political trophies. He argues that the Soviet Union is already within 35 miles of Berlin, while the Western Allies are still 200 miles away, separated by the Elbe River. Berlin, Eisenhower writes with a clinical coldness, has become a mere name. In London, the reply hits like a shell. Churchill reads the words and feels the world shifting beneath his feet. The mere name Eisenhower dismissed was the heart of the Prussian military machine, the psychological center of gravity for the entire German people. By abandoning the race for Berlin, Eisenhower wasn't just saving lives. In Churchill's eyes, he was handing the keys of Central Europe to the Kremlin. The friction spreads. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the face of British military pride, is livid. He had been promised the lead in the northern thrust toward Berlin. Now he finds his role diminished, his supplies diverted to the American generals Bradley and Patton in the south. The Americans have no vision, Montgomery fumes to his staff. They are winning the war, but they are losing the peace. The disagreement turns into a blistering exchange of cables between London and Washington. Churchill appeals to President Roosevelt, but the president is a dying man, his strength fading as fast as the spring snow. The American leadership stands united behind Eisenhower's broad front strategy. They see Churchill's obsession with Berlin as an old-world pursuit of empire and prestige, something they are not willing to spill American blood for. Churchill stands at the window of the map room, looking out at a London that is finally emerging from the darkness of the war. He realizes that the Great Alliance is no longer a partnership of equals. The United States is now the undisputed master of the West, and their master is Eisenhower. He realizes that if he cannot change Ike's mind, the map of Europe will be redrawn not by treaties, but by the mud-stained boots of the Red Army. He has one final card to play, a face-to-face meeting on the banks of the Rhine. But as he prepares to cross the river into Germany, a new report reaches his desk, one that suggests the National Redoubt Eisenhower is so afraid of might be a total fabrication of Nazi propaganda. The wind whipping across the river carries the scent of gunpowder and blooming spring, a jarring contrast that mirrors Churchill's own internal conflict. He stands on German soil, a defiant figure in a heavy overcoat, watching the endless stream of American trucks and tanks rolling eastward. But they aren't heading toward Berlin. They are turning south. Intelligence reports, often fueled by Joseph Goebbels' desperate propaganda machine, had convinced Eisenhower's staff that the Nazis were preparing for a last stand in the Bavarian Alps. They called it the Alpenfesten, the National Redoubt. Rumors swirled of underground factories, indestructible fortresses, and a fanatical SS elite prepared to fight for years in the mountain peaks. A ghost story, Churchill snorts, flicking ash into the German mud. We are chasing shadows while the substance of Europe is being devoured. Churchill knew the truth. The German army was a broken shell, its logistics shattered. There was no mountain fortress. But Eisenhower, ever the cautious planner, refused to leave his flank exposed to a phantom. This strategic disagreement wasn't just about maps anymore. It was about the fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. Ike feared a military disaster. Churchill feared a political catastrophe. Visual: a split screen on one side, a grainy photo of Hitler's actual modest mountain retreat. On the other, a dramatic Allied intelligence sketch of a fictional, sprawling underground mountain city. Then the world stops. Warm Springs, Georgia. President Franklin D. Roosevelt is dead. The news hits Churchill like a physical blow. Roosevelt was his bridge to the Americans, the man he had charmed, cajoled, and collaborated with for years. Now, the bridge is gone. In his place stands Harry Truman, a man Churchill barely knows, and a man who is even more inclined to defer to Eisenhower's military judgment than FDR was. The special relationship has just lost its architect. Churchill feels a sudden, chilling isolation. He is now the lone voice screaming about the Soviet threat in a room full of generals who only want to see the checkmate on the board. He turns his gaze back to the east. Somewhere beyond the smoke of the horizon, the Red Army is crossing the Oder. They aren't worrying about national redoubts or logistics. They are running toward the Reichstag with a singular bloody-minded purpose. Churchill realizes that his last chance to influence the shape of the post-war world is slipping through his fingers. He decides on one final desperate maneuver. He will bypass the generals and appeal directly to the Russian bear himself. But even as he prepares the message, he wonders, has Eisenhower's delay already made the fall of the West inevitable? May 2, 1945, 2 p.m. The Cabinet Room, 10 Downing Street. The news arrives not with a bang, but with a heavy, somber finality. The Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, is flying over the scorched ruins of the Reichstag. Berlin has fallen. Churchill sits at the head of the long table, the silence in the room echoing the void in his chest. Eisenhower's broad front had been a military success. The German armies were surrendered or destroyed. But the political cost Churchill had predicted was now a reality. The Red Army didn't just take Berlin. They took the soul of Central Europe. "We shall have a rough time of it," Churchill mutters to his private secretary. The Allied unity that had won the war was now evaporating in the heat of the victory. Reports were filtering in of the liberated territories, mass deportations, the systematic dismantling of Polish sovereignty, and the brutal installation of Soviet puppet regimes. The special relationship with Eisenhower, once so warm, had cooled into a professional distance. Churchill could not forgive the general for ignoring the strategic necessity of Berlin, and Eisenhower could not understand why the Prime Minister was so focused on the next war before the current one was even over. As the dust settled, the reality of the New World Order became clear. The United States and the Soviet Union were the new titans, and Britain, though victorious, was exhausted and sidelined. Churchill's foresight had been his curse. He had seen the Iron Curtain falling while others were still celebrating the end of the Blitz. On May 8th, VE Day, Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, waving to the cheering crowds. Thousands of voices sang "Land of Hope and Glory." But those close to him saw the sadness in his eyes. He knew that the peace they were celebrating was a fragile one, bought at the price of divided Europe. He would later write in his memoirs about this period, describing the friction with Eisenhower not as a personal feud, but as a tragic clash of philosophies. One man was a liberator. The other was a protector of the future. The exchange between the Prime Minister and the General remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. If Eisenhower had listened, if the Allies had taken Berlin, would the Cold War have ever happened? Or would it have simply started sooner, with American and Soviet tanks facing off in the streets of a city that was still burning? Churchill looked out at the sea of faces in Whitehall, his hand raised in the iconic V for victory. But in his mind, he was already drafting the speech he would give a year later in Fulton, Missouri, the speech that would finally name the darkness he had tried so hard to prevent. The war was over. The struggle for the world had just begun.